Hello everyone, welcome back to our lecture on rivers and why they're so important. We're going to continue on talking about water quality and how river flow plays into that. And the reason why rivers are so important for making sure we have high water quality is because of a fun phrase that goes, dilution is the solution to pollution. And all that means is that the higher amount of water flowing through the system, the more that a source of pollution can be diluted out and have a lower concentration. You can see that here as you have more stream flow and you have more water mixing in with this pollution source, you tend to have lower concentrations. Sometimes that can be our only option in terms of making sure that water quality is not seriously impacted by some sort of pollution source. So what are those pollution sources? There are two different types of pollution sources, one of them being a point source and the other being a non-point source. So a point source is an area such as a pipe coming out of a factory that dumps immediately into the river. So point source is a pollution source in which you can immediately point to where that pollution is coming from. It's a single location. Whereas a non-point source has a dispersed pollution source, such as runoff from a city or a suburb that has pollution coming off over an entire hill slope or a much larger area where you can't immediately point to one location. So the types of pollutions that come from point sources versus non-point sources can vary, and the treatment for them can vary as well. So what are the types of pollutants that we're talking about? There's several different types, and we'll go through each one. So the first is fertilizers. So whenever you have a farm, usually you have fertilizers that go on that farm, or such as lawns or golf courses can also have fertilizers that are being put on them to grow more effectively. And these fertilizers often have high concentrations of nitrates and phosphates. It's usually a limiting resource for a lot of plants. And so when those nitrates and phosphates go into a river, they can cause eutrophication, which is when you have algal blooms that occur and excessive bacteria growth because of that excess nutrient supply. Next, we have pesticides. You may have heard of DDT, which is a powerful pesticide used early in the 19th century or the 20th century. And so pesticides are used in order to reduce the number of pests on crops, and they can flow into a river from farmland or runoff from roads, and as a result can impact the biodiversity of a river and significantly kill off different animals that aren't able to withstand those pesticides. Next, we have metals, heavy metals. This can include lead and mercury, copper, and all sorts of different metals. And most of these come from factories. They can also come from heavily eroded pipes that have not been changed. And so they can cause a lot of toxicity. You may have heard of the Flint water crisis. So that water quality issue that happened there, and to some extent still happening there, it was the result of the lead pipes that were used in the city, and the lead leaching out into the water supply and posing a health risk. So lead in the water can decrease brain function and be really serious, especially for young people that drink that water. Next, we have radioactive waste. So power plants scientific or medical facilities can have radioactive waste that they need to get rid of or store somehow. And while there's usually facilities that take careful care to make sure that it doesn't get out into the environment, there's always some amount of leakages that can occur. So you can have uranium and thorium getting into the water supply. And that's really important to monitor because those radioactive waste is a carcinogen and can cause cancer. Next, we have acids and bases. So, for example, when you have a lot of pollution going into the air, such as sulfur dioxide and nitrics, then those chemicals can turn into acid rain in the clouds and rain out into the river, and as a result can cause the acidity of the river to change to the point where plants and the soil is not very productive. And so you can have low fertility that results from extensive acid rain from factories. Next, we have petroleum. We all know that if we have an oil spill on a waterway, it's a big deal. So oil or gasoline that gets onto a river can really impact the wildlife, and it's very toxic. And you can have oil that runs off both from a road when you have an oil leak that washes off in the rain and drains into the river, or you can have a leaky water tank either underground or above ground. Then petroleum and gas can get into the water and can be very costly to clean up. Next, another pollution source that's rarely thought about is thermal pollution. So heat is a big factor for the productivity of rivers. And a lot of times you have facilities that can produce huge amounts of heat. This is an example of a power plant here in thermal imagery. And so a lot of power plants use water supplies from rivers in order to cool their facility and prevent meltdowns. But as a result, they pump out very hot water as a result, and that can be a really big stress to the species that are living there. For example, fish have much lower metabolisms and ability to hunt for food when the water temperature is higher. Next, we have disease-carrying organisms. Organisms such as Giardia or Cryptosporidium can get into the water supply. This is mainly from dumping human waste from a waste treatment center or runoff from a livestock facility, more likely. And obviously, disease-carrying organisms can cause diseases. And so these are definitely something that have to be kept in mind. And it's one of the reasons why we add chlorine usually to the water supply in order to kill off these types of bacteria that can be really dangerous and sensitive to chlorine concentrations. And then lastly is sediment. So sediment is always moving through a stream, even without people around. But if you have really high concentrations of sediment, it can make it not as healthy to drink, and it can lead to anoxia, which is low concentrations of oxygen in the water, which can then lead to lower photosynthesis rates, as well as the fact that when you have more sediment, you have more deposition, and therefore eggs, such as fish eggs, can get buried more easily. And so this turbidity can be caused by landslides, as well as some sort of impervious surface, such as a road, that leads to more sediment getting washed into the river instead of getting cycled through the soil. So those are the types of pollutants that we can have, but what does water quality look like throughout the United States? And the unfortunate truth is that water quality has been declining. You can see here we have the per capita number of water quality issues, water quality reports that have been filed for each state. You have Hawaii and Alabama having some of the best water quality per capita in terms of reporting, and then Alaska and Montana having some of the worst, mainly because they have still high levels of water quality issues, but also low populations. And here are the number of violations per community water system. And you can see areas such as Oklahoma have upwards of 100 violations per individual community water system. So there's a lot of potential danger that's associated with violating these water quality standards. We can see here that the number of violations, while having several dips throughout history due to different legislation, has generally been increasing. These are the total number of violations, and it's broken down by the type of pollutant as well. But you can see here that since the 1980s, it's steadily been rising. And that rise in the number of violations has also been most significant in rural areas, especially rural low-income areas, where you have a really dramatic increase, especially since the early 2000s. Whereas in urban areas, you generally have more stringent regulations on water quality, and the number of violations has been relatively constant over time. Part of the reasons why we have so many water quality violations is because we spend less on water treatment now than we have in the last 50 years. So here is the amount of federal spending on water and wastewater utility infrastructure over time. You can see that we were at one point spending $16.8 billion per year on water quality treatment and infrastructure, such as making sure that pipes are still in good standing. And now we spend nearly a quarter of that much. So that's definitely a dramatic decrease in how much cities and the federal government are spending to make sure our water quality is safe. And as a result, we see that there are a number of deaths that are caused by unsafe drinking water and decreases in hygiene from those water quality issues. So these are the number of deaths per million people. And we see in the United States, we still have some deaths related to water quality, but also we have decreases in health, including mental health, as some pollutants can cause mental health issues. And then in other areas such as India, which has the Ganges River that's highly polluted, as well as Africa, has hundreds to thousands of deaths per million people due to water quality issues. So this is definitely a serious concern and can cause a lot of health concerns. Next, we're going to be talking about riparian habitats. So rivers are really important for providing habitat for animals and life forms living in them. So rivers provide habitat for a wide range of species, all the way from birds and fish down to algae and bacteria and phytoplankton. And so when you have a healthy river system, you can have a really diverse a range of organisms that live there. And part of the reasons why you have so much biodiversity is because of ecological succession. As you move further away from the river, you have different kinds of plants that can live there. So in the littoral zone, that's the area that is usually completely covered in water. You can have plants such as eelgrass, and then as you move into the emergent zone that's near the shoreline, you can have plants more like pickleweed, and then the riparian zone is higher than that and is usually dry, but can be covered in high floods, where you have such things as switchgrass, and then even higher up you have the least flood tolerant species such as trees that can grow. And you can see here all the different benefits that can result in having a flood occur. So flood variability tends to increase the productivity of the ecosystem. You can have increases in water quality, increases in the amount of spawning of fish that result when you have flooding occur. So having that variable flood conditions and not just completely controlling the water flow is really important for the habitat that lives there. You can see that here. This is a photo that a friend of mine took on the Sacramento River, where these are fish that grew within the main channel of the river, whereas these are fish that grew during the flood events, where they could grow up on the floodplain and grow within the rice fields that were around the river valley. And these fish, as you can see, while anecdotal, are significantly larger than the fish that grew up in the main channel. So increased flows to these rivers can increase productivity and increase fish growth. That all gets complicated by the fact that we have dams a lot of times on rivers. And so these dams, they impound the water flowing down the river and can have a number of impactful side effects to them besides their impact on flood controls. One of them is that when you have that water sitting around in that upper basin for so long, it's exposed to more sunlight, and therefore it increases the temperature of the water. And as we talked about before, high temperatures are kind of like a pollutant and can decrease productivity of different species. Additionally, you have all the pollutants that come washing into the river get consolidated into this basin, and you can have algal blooms and a pollution accumulation that results. And then because you're impounding the sediment and not allowing it to flow beyond the dam, you can have erosion that occurs downstream and deposition of sediment upstream, and that can have effects on turbidity as well. And then because you have increases in temperature and increases in bacterial growth and algal blooms, you tend to have lower concentrations of oxygen in areas with dams compared to naturally flowing streams. And so if you want to make sure that you're following all the environmental regulations, you have to make sure that you're managing all of these impacts and trying to mimic the flow of the river as best as possible so that you don't have pollution-related impacts that result. One of the most impactful species within riparian systems, river systems, are beavers. So beavers are what's known as a keystone species. This is a species that can greatly increase the biodiversity and productivity of a river system. You can see here that when you have a beaver dams can block the flow and allow water to pool up in a beaver lake without seriously impacting the sediment or the pollutions that might be flowing into this river. They can all kind of flow outwards as well through the beaver dam. But what results is that you have a lake where you have that habitat being established for more waterfowl and fish species. And so a lot of times the best remediation strategy for a river that's been heavily impacted is to just bring some beavers in and have them work their magic in order to restore it to its natural functionings. So next, we're going to be talking about transportation. Rivers are extremely important for transporting goods throughout the world and throughout the United States. You can carry huge amounts of material in big barges like this one, and because of that, they transport a lot of the goods that we transport throughout the United States. And so rivers kind of act as highways. You can see here that the Mississippi River, for example, transports several millions of tons of freight every year. So it's definitely a significant amount when you compare it to some of the major roadways and railways around the United States. Here is a map showing all the different navigable waterways within the United States, including the Mississippi River, some smaller waterways along the coast, and the Columbia River, which is the largest navigable waterway in the West Coast. And so an important thing about these navigable waterways is that transporting materials via rivers costs about 2/3 of the amount that it costs to transport something via railroad, and about 1/10 the cost of transporting it via truck. And so it's hugely more cost effective to transport it, if you can, via a river waterway than via rail or truck. And so making sure that these rivers can sustain transportation is definitely important. You can see the value of all those goods that are being traded via inland waterways here. We have 630 million tons of materials transported via inland waterway each year. That's equivalent to $73 billion, or 17% of our total trafficked goods. So that's equivalent of taking 25 million trucks off the road. So it's definitely a major constituent and can lead to decreased carbon emissions. You can see here these are the states in red and orange having the greatest amount of transportation via inland waterways. One kind of wrench in that whole system, though, is that that inland waterways tend to transport a lot of fossil fuels. So while the transport of materials via inland waterways can reduce the amount of carbon emissions by 10 million metric tons every year, just because you have fewer trucks on the road, it also, the main products that are being transported tend to decrease the cost of fossil fuels. You can see here that 48% of all materials transported by inland waterway are fossil fuels, and then the rest are minerals and steel and chemicals, and then some agricultural products as well. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword is when you have decreases in emissions due to less transportation via other mechanisms, but also a decreasing cost of fossil fuels due to them being able to be transported easily via inland waterway. So next, we're going to be talking about hydropower. Hydropower, as we saw, is a really important factor for the United States. It's how we use a large portion of the water that we use. And it's a very important renewable energy source. And so you can see here, this is a map showing all of the U.S. hydropower dams, and with the colors indicating which agency operates those dams, whether it's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in orange, the Bureau of Reclamation that controls the Hoover Dam that we just saw, that picture that I had taken this past spring, as well as non-federal agencies as well. And so before we move any further, it's a good idea to just get an idea of how a dam actually generates power. And so when you have a dam, you have water that's stored up behind the dam that's higher up than the water below it. And to run your power plant, you open up an opening in the dam, and that opening is called a sluice gate. And that water flows through the penstock, which is the pipe works through the dam, into the turbine. And so these turbines can be truly massive. Here's a person for scale of how big these turbines are for the Hoover Dam. And as water flows past these turbine blades, it spins the whole turbine, and that causes the rotor to spin, and that rotor then powers a generator due to the electricity that's generated as it spins relative to the stator. So when you have that electricity being generated, then you have the power lines coming out, going through the transformer, and then out to the power grid that it's powering. So that's generally kind of simply how hydropower plants work. And the great thing about hydropower plants is that they're incredibly energy efficient. By far, they're the most energy efficient form of electricity compared to any other source. So the amount of energy stored in that water due to gravitational potential energy gets converted into electricity with very little losses compared to other sources. And that can definitely come into play when we're discussing how useful hydropower is. So how much hydropower does the U.S. actually use compared to other sources? We can see here, this is the total U.S. energy consumption for 2017. Only 11% of our energy consumption comes from renewable energy, unfortunately. But we can see here that 25% of that renewable energy comes from hydroelectric power. So about 3% of our total energy consumption comes from hydropower generation. If we look at just electricity, remember electricity is just a subset of energy. For example, your car uses the energy of gasoline, but it's not actually producing electricity unless it's an electric vehicle. And if we look at just electricity, then hydropower provides 6% of our total electricity use, so significantly more, but still much less than coal, natural gas, and nuclear power. We can look at each individual state as well and see where hydropower is most dominant. In Washington State, by far has the most hydroelectric power generation capacity, and it produces more than a quarter of the total hydroelectric power of the entire United States. And that's followed by California and Oregon, where you have these very large dams that have been set up on the only major rivers there. If we look at hydropower over time compared to renewable energy sources, then we can see that the amount of hydroelectric power is proportional to different weather events. So the more water you have flooding into reservoirs, the more hydropower that you can generate. And as water and precipitation gets more variable, then the amount of hydropower that you can generate also becomes less reliable. And you can see here that we have a very slight decrease in the amount of hydroelectric power that's been generated over time since the mid-90s. In contrast, you can see here that other renewable sources such as wind and solar have been exponentially increasing over time. And so now they are providing more electricity than hydropower when you combine all of them together. And it's expected that hydroelectricity, we're kind of at close to a max of how much we can actually generate just because we only have so many rivers, whereas renewable energy sources such as wind and solar can be greatly increased to provide more electricity. So let's look at this globally, and we can see that while the US supplies about 3% of its energy from hydropower. Throughout the world, it's slightly more. We have 3.8% of the world's energy consumption coming from hydropower. You can see here. And so there's a number of large hydropower plants that can produce a lot of electricity. The most electricity produced from hydropower plants is in China, followed by Brazil and Canada, and the United States being fourth. And the reason why China produces so much hydroelectric power is in part due to the fact that they built the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest dam in the world in terms of power production. And to put how gigantic this dam is into scale, there's so much water backed up behind this dam that it actually changed the rotation rate of the Earth. You can think of a figure skater as they bring their arms in, they spin faster, and when they move their arms out, they spin slower. Well, making a dam on the planet is kind of like extending your arms, and it's keeping more water weight further from the Earth's core. And as a result, the Earth's rotation has slowed, and from general relativity, we know that if you change your speed, you're also changing time. And so the Three Gorges Dam has changed the length of a day by 60 nanoseconds longer every day. So you can thank China for those extra 60 nanoseconds that you get out of your day every day. Another really important aspect of hydropower is a system called pumped storage. And these are pumping up all over, or no pun intended, popping up all over the place nowadays. And so pumped storage is, strangely enough, running a hydroelectric power plant in reverse. And so you have a lower basin where you have water, and you're running your power plant so that you're pumping water into this upper basin. You might ask why you would ever do that. And the reason is because that hydropower plant is so efficient at converting energy, then when you have water that's stored in this upper basin, then this whole system kind of acts as a gigantic battery. And so whenever you need that electricity, you can run that powerhouse regularly and produce electricity. But when electricity is cheap, you can run that powerhouse in reverse and pump it back into that upper basin. And this is really important if we are to expand the use of wind and solar, because the output of wind and solar are highly variable. And for example, solar energy peaks during the daytime when it's most sunny. And so you can use that time of day when electricity is most cheap to pump that water up into the upper basin, and then run that power plant in as normally at night when you have less power being produced by the solar farm. And so pump storage facilities act as some of the largest batteries facilities in the world, and are definitely important for making sure that we have a future with renewable energy. And we can see here that the number of pump storage facilities has been greatly increased as we also have an increase in renewable energy use. And so the amount of power that's being stored in these facilities has been increasing by several hundred gigawatts of power over the last 100 years. And most of these facilities are located in the United States, in Europe, and some in India and Asia. So that's hydropower, and that gives us an idea of how rivers are so important in terms of our energy grid. We'll take a break now, and we'll return to talk more about why rivers are so important to study in terms of geography. But I'll see you guys in just a bit when we continue this discussion. All right, see you soon.